Welcome back to Teaching Statistical Thinking. In our last video, we looked at how to describe the relationship between two categorical variables using what's called a mosaic plot. Today what we're going to do is we're going to use the information in that mosaic plot to come up with number summaries for the relationship between two categorical variables, and that's going to be called the contingency table. Recall back to our example, we were looking at what is the relationship between whether the movie was produced by an independent or major studio and whether the production budget for the movie fell into the first, second, third, or fourth quartiles. To do our contingency table, I'm going to let the rows of my table be whether the studio was independent or whether it was a major studio. My contingency table is going to contain 4 sets of numbers when we finish. It's going to contain counts, total percents, column percents, and row percents. The columns of my contingency table are going to stand for the 4 quartiles. Quartile 1, quartile 2, quartile 3, and quartile 4. My last column will be a total, and my last row will be a total. We started out with 134 movies. That goes in our lower right corner. Of our movies, 24% were independent, or that was 32 of our movies. Of our major studio movies, it was 76%, and that came to 102. They sum up to 134. In our quartiles, we made them so that about 25% fell into each quartile. However, 134 is not divisible by 4, so we ended up with 34 in quartile 1, 33 in quartile 2, 34 in quartile 3, and 33 in quartile 4. Now, as we look at the mosaic plot or our 2 bar charts, we want to fill in what were the counts of the variables, the counts of the observations that fell into each of these cells. 53% of our independent movies were in quartile 1. Well, that means that 17 of our movies were independents that fell into quartile 1. Of our independents, 19%, or 6 movies, were in quartile 2. Quartile 3, 22%, or 7 of our movies were in quartile 3. And finally, 6%, or 2 of our movies, were in quartile 4. For major studios, those numbers are 17, 27, 27, and 31. These are our counts, and this is our basic contingency table. It tells us how many movies fell into each particular cell that marks whether the movie was independent or a major studio, along with whether their production budget was in the first, second, third, or fourth quartile. Our column counts should add up to the total for that column. 34, 33, 34, and 33. Our second number in our contingency table is what's called a total percent. It's simply of the observations that fell in a cell, they represent what percent of total movies. So 17 over 134 is equal to about 13%. About 13% of our movies were made by independent studios and fell in the first quartile. 6 out of 134, which is about 4.5%, were independent movies that fell in the second quartile. And we just continue to fill out the rest of the table. 7 is about 5%. 2 is about 1.5%. For independents, we do the same thing. 17 out of 134 is going to, again, be 13%. 27 out of 134 is about 20%. 27 out of 134, about 20%. And 31 out of 34, about 23%. If we added up the total percents in our whole table, 13 plus 4.5 plus 5 plus 1.5 plus 13 plus 20 plus 20 plus 23, it should add up to 100%. Now we're going to move to the column percents. The column percent is given that you fall in a particular column, what's the chance you're independent or a major studio? Quartile 1 includes 34 movies. 17 over 34 is equal to 50%. For our major studios, we also have 17 over 34, which is a 50%. So of the quartile 1 movies, those that had a production budget in the first quartile, 50% were independent and 50% were a major studio. We can do the same thing for quartile 2, quartile 3, and quartile 4. For quartile 2, about 18% of the movies were independent and about 82% were major studios. In quartile 3, about 21% were independents and 79% were major studios. For our last quartile, about 6% were independent and about 94% were major studios. Note that the column percents add up to 100% within each column. The final number that we'll add to our table is the row percents. The row percents say, given a movie is independent, what's the chance that it fell into quartile 1, 2, 3, or 4? So it looks just like our bar chart. Okay. Of the independent movies, of which there's 32, 17 out of 32, or 53%, fell into the first quartile. 6 out of 32, or 19%, fell into the second quartile. 7 out of 32, or 22%, fell into the third quartile. And 2 out of 32, or 6%, fell into the fourth quartile. Note that the row percents add up to 100% going across the rows. If we add the row percents for for major studios, we can just pull them off our bar chart. 17%, 26.5%, 26.5%, and 30%. If we look at the percentages of the total of our columns, each represented 25%. If the two variables had no association, we'd expect that 25% to be represented in the row percentages for each row. Again, we see that the independents were much more likely to be in quartile 1 than 25% of the time. Major studios were much less likely to be in quartile 1 than 25% of the time. At the other extreme, our independents were much less likely to be in quartile 4 than 25%, and our major studios were much more likely to be in the fourth quartile than 25%. That's telling us that our two variables have an association. The same works if we go by the column percents. We had 24% of our movies were independent, 76% were major studios. we'd expect that ratio of 24 to 76 in each of our column percents within each column if the two variables were not associated. However, we see in quartile 1, it's 50 versus 50. In quartile 2, 18 versus 82. Quartile 3, 21 versus 79. And quartile 6, 6 versus 94. So it's not mimicking the 24 and 76 at all, showing that these two variables have a strong association. So that's what you need to know about comparing two categorical variables. In our next video, we'll be moving it a step further where we look at the relationship between two variables, but one of them will be categorical and one of them will be numeric. See you then. So let's see whether our students have got it. Come on in, Jeffrey.
All right.
Okay. Using our movie data set, I'm going to ask you a couple questions about percentages, and I want you to tell me the percentage of movies that fall in a particular description.
All right.
I want you to tell me what proportion of our movies in our movie data set were done by major studios and fell in the third quintile.
All right, so for that question, we'll be looking at the total percent. So if we go to major studio and then third quintile, that should be 20% right there. I know I circled some.
Okay, 20% is correct. Okay, now let's do a different one. If a movie was done by an independent studio, what proportion fell in the second quartile?
All right, so since independent is in this row right here, we'll be looking at the row percentiles this time. And for the second quartile, that would be 19%.
That's correct. Now, of our movies that are in the fourth quartile, what percent are independent?
All right, so for this one, we'll be looking at the column percentiles. And so under the fourth quarter, we'll go to the column percentile, which should be 6%.
That's correct. You've got it.
All right.
Thanks.